Motion carries. Dr. Friedberg, welcome.
Senator McCain, Senator Reid, thank you very much, members of the committee. I appreciate very much the opportunity to express my views on these important subjects. In the time available, I'd like to try to make three main points. First, as Senator McCain, I think, has already indicated, I don't think the United States currently has a coherent, integrated national strategy for the Asia-Pacific region, and in particular, it lacks a strategy for dealing with an increasingly powerful and assertive China. What we have instead are the remnants of a strategy first put in place over 2 decades ago. Some aspirational goals and a set of policies and programs intended to achieve them that are now in varying states of disrepair and which are, in any event, largely disconnected from one another. Second, China does have such a strategy, not only for the Asia-Pacific, but for the continental domain along its land frontiers. The goal of Beijing's strategy, as has become increasingly clear in the last few years, is to create a regional Eurasian order that's very different from the one we've been trying to build since the end of the Cold War. And third, just because Beijing has a strategy doesn't mean it'll succeed. China has many weaknesses and liabilities. We and our allies have many strengths. But I do think we've reached the point where it's essential that we re-examine our goals, review our strategy, and adjust our policies accordingly. And the start of a new administration would naturally be the time to attempt such review. It simply becomes more difficult as time goes on and more issues accumulate. Let me try to expand on each of those points. When the Cold War ended, the United States set out to expand the geographic scope of the Western liberal economic and institutional order by integrating the pieces of the former Soviet Union and the former Soviet Empire, and by accelerating the integration of China, a process that had begun a few years before. As regards China, the United States pursued a two-pronged strategy, on the one hand seeking to engage China across all domains, economic in particular, but diplomatic and others, and at the same time working with our allies and partners and maintaining our own forces in the region to preserve a balance of power that was favorable to our interests and to the security of our allies. And the goals of that policy were to preserve stability, to deter the possibility of aggression, while waiting for engagement to work its magic. The U.S. hoped, in effect, to tame and ultimately to transform China, to encourage its leaders to see their interests as lying in the preservation of that order, and to set in motion processes that would lead eventually to the economic and political liberalization of that country. As in Europe, so also in Asia, our ultimate aim was to build a region whole and free, an open, liberal region in an open and liberal world. Since the turn of the century, it's become increasingly apparent that this approach hasn't worked, at least not yet. Engagement has not achieved its intended results. China is obviously far stronger, far richer, but it's more repressive domestically than at any time since the Cultural Revolution. It continues to rely heavily on mercantilist economic policies that impose costs on other countries, including ours. And its external behavior has become increasingly assertive, even aggressive, most notably, but not entirely, in the maritime domain. And meanwhile, engagement not working, balancing has become more difficult for us and for our allies because of the growth of China's military capabilities. So second, what accounts for this recent shift in Chinese behavior? The short answer to that question is that Beijing's increased assertiveness is driven by a mix of optimism and even arrogance on the one hand, and also deep insecurity. For roughly the first 15 years or so after the end of the Cold War, China's rulers followed the wisdom of Deng Xiaoping, who advised in 1991 that China should hide its capabilities and bide its time, avoid confrontation, build up all the elements of its national power, and advance cautiously towards eventually achieving a position, reestablishing China as a preponderant power in the region. Things began to change in 2008 with the onset of the financial crisis, and these changes have accelerated and become institutionalized since 2013 with the accession of Xi Jinping to top positions in the party and the state. Basically, the financial crisis caused Chinese strategists to conclude that the United States was declining more rapidly than had been expected, and that China was therefore able to rise more quickly than had been hoped. It was time then for China to step up, to become clearer in defining its core interests and more assertive in pursuing them. At the same time, however, the crisis also deepened the Chinese leadership's underlying concerns about their prospects for sustaining economic growth and preserving social stability. So China is behaving more assertively, both because its leaders want to seize the opportunities presented to them by what they see as a more favorable external situation, and because they feel the need to bolster their legitimacy and to rally domestic support by courting controlled confrontations with others whom they can present as hostile foreign forces, including Japan and the United States. China's actions aren't limited to pursuing its claims and trying to extend its zone of effective control in the maritime domain. Along its land frontiers, Beijing has also unveiled a hugely ambitious set of infrastructure development plans, the so-called One Belt, One Road initiative, which aims to transform the economic and strategic geography of much of Eurasia. China's leaders have begun to articulate their vision for a new Eurasian order, a system of infrastructure networks, regional free trade areas, new rules written in Beijing, and mechanisms for political consultation, all with China at the center and the United States pushed to the periphery, if not out of the region altogether. In this vision, U.S. alliances would either be dissolved or drained of their significance. Maritime democracies would be divided from one another and relatively weak, and China, meanwhile, would be surrounded on the continent by friendly and subservient authoritarian regimes. So if in the 20th century the United States tried to make the world safe for democracy, in the 21st, China is trying to make the world safe for authoritarianism, or at least it's trying to make Asia safe for continued Communist Party rule of China. And they're using and trying to coordinate all the instruments of policy to achieve these ends. Military domain, building up both conventional so-called anti-access area denial capabilities, and they're modernizing their nuclear forces in order to deter possible U.S. intervention and to raise questions about the continued viability of our security guarantees, and also developing other instruments, lawfare, the Little Blue Men, maritime militia, island construction, to advance towards their goals, create facts without provoking confrontation. Economically, they've been using the growing gravitational pull of their economy to draw others towards them. And also, they become increasingly open in using economic threats and punishments to try to shape the behavior of others in the region, including U.S. allies, as Dr. Cha mentioned, Korea and also the Philippines. And China has been engaging in what Chinese strategists refer to as political warfare, attempts to shape the perceptions of both leaders and elites and publics by conveying the message that China's growing wealth and power present an opportunity rather than a threat to its neighbors, while raising questions about the continued reliability and leadership capacity of the United States. And I think it's important to note also that China is waging political warfare against us, holding out the prospect of cooperation on trade and on North Korea, which I think is now going to be, again, a part of that process, even as they work to undermine and weaken our position in the long run. So finally, and very briefly, how should the United States respond? As I stated at the outset, I think the time has come for a fundamental re-examination of our strategy towards China and towards the Asia-Pacific and indeed the entire Eurasian domain more broadly. A serious effort along these lines would look at all the various instruments of power, the various aspects of our policy, which I think now are largely fragmented and dealt with separately, and consider the ways in which they might be better integrated. And it would also weigh the possible costs and benefits and risks of alternative strategies. And a useful model here would be the so-called Solarium Project, a review of possible approaches for dealing with the Soviet Union that was undertaken in 1953 during the early months of the Eisenhower administration. To my knowledge, in the last 25 years, there has been no such exercise regarding our policies towards Asia and towards China. So we're effectively running on the fumes of a strategy that was put into place a quarter century ago. Obviously, Congress can't do such an assessment itself, but it might wish to consider mandating such review, as it did in requiring a general statement of national security strategy in 1986 and the Quadrennial Defense Review in 1997. I'm afraid my clock isn't working, so I'm sure that I've already gone over time. I can't claim to have conducted such an exercise myself, but I'd like to close with just a few thoughts about some of the issues that it might address and perhaps some of the conclusions towards which it might lean. First and most basic is what is it that we are trying to achieve? If an Asia whole and free is out of reach, at least for now, and if a region reshaped according to Beijing's vision would be threatening to our interests and to our values, as I think it would be, how should we define our strategic goals? Now, part of the answer here, I think, is likely to be that we'll need to rededicate ourselves to defending those parts of the Asian regional system that remain open and liberal, including our allies, the rules which they abide, and the commons that connects them. It's sometimes said that in order to accommodate China's rising power and avoid conflict, we will need to compromise, and that's certainly true. But there are some issues where it will not be possible to split the difference, and we need to be clear about what those are. In the economic domain, if we don't want others to be drawn increasingly into a kind of Chinese co-prosperity sphere, we need to provide them with the greatest possible opportunity to remain engaged in mutually beneficial trade and investment with us and with one another. Whatever its economic merits, TPP had significant strategic benefits in this regard, and it's not clear at this point what, if anything, will take its place. As regards military strategy, for good reason, a great deal of energy has been devoted recently to figuring out how to respond to these Chinese initiatives in the so-called gray zone. As important as this problem is, it seems to me that it's subordinate to the larger question of how we and our allies can counter China's evolving anti-access area denial strategy. And we're in kind of an odd position now of having raised this issue in a very visible way back in 2011 with the creation of the Air-Sea Battle Office, and then seeming to back away from it. And while there's obviously a limit to what we can and should say in public, we are at a point, I think, where we need to be able to explain to our allies, our possible adversaries, and ourselves how we would fight and win a war in Asia should that ever become necessary. Finally, there's this delicate issue of political warfare. What is, as Senator Reid mentioned, what's our counter to the narrative that the Chinese are now pushing across much of Asia, in which we're portrayed as internally divided, as unable to solve our domestic problems, as inward-turning, unreliable, and potentially dangerous, while China presents itself as the wave of the future, economically dynamic, efficient, unthreatening, non-judgmental, loaded with cash, and eager to do business. In this regard, it seems to me that it would be a serious mistake, strategic as well as moral, to drop the subjects of human rights and universal values from our discussions with and about China. Our commitment to these values and our demonstrated willingness to defend them are still among our greatest assets. And being seen to abandon them in the face of China's growing wealth and power will embolden Beijing and other authoritarian regimes, discourage our allies, and demoralize those people in China and around the world who often at great personal risk continue to advocate for freedom. Thank you very much.
Chairman McCain, Ranking Member Reid, other distinguished committee members, thank you for convening this important and very timely hearing today. I want to commend the committee for its steadfast bipartisan leadership on all matters of peace and security in the Asia-Pacific. That's extremely important, as well as your steadfast commitment to our men and women in uniform and the civilians that serve alongside them, so thank you. Also, thank you to my fellow panelists here, whose counsel I drew upon quite a bit while I was in government. I think you're going to hear a lot of similarity in our testimony today. So let me try to quickly summarize my testimony that I've submitted for the record. Bottom line up front, while some may prefer to discard the rhetoric of the rebalance, we need to follow through on its strategic intent. Because if we don't, American primacy in the most consequential region in the world is at risk. I'll go one step further by saying mere continuity effort is not going to be enough to stem the tide. We need to encourage the new administration to present an affirmative vision and strategy for the region, as the other panelists have discussed, and to avoid ad hoc approaches. And this needs to start with a clear-eyed view of our interests and the necessity of preserving our position through any means necessary to advance our interests. So with that theme in mind, I'd like to highlight what I see as the top 3 challenges and opportunities facing the United States and the Asia-Pacific. Of course, the first most urgent challenge is North Korea and its relentless pursuit of its ballistic missile programs and nuclear program, a challenge that has vexed multiple administrations, including the Obama administration most recently. The bottom line here is that we need a new playbook. First, we need to increase the pressure on North Korea as a necessary predicate to any other option. China is central to that, but we can't rely only on Chinese pressure. We also need to be realistic. Kim Jong-un is not going to unilaterally disarm because of international pressure. Pressure alone is not going to solve the problem. Second, military options should remain on the table, but they are extremely high risk and should be a last resort. We should not kid ourselves here. A conflict on the peninsula would be unlike anything we have seen in decades. North Korea is not a Syria. It's not an Iraq. The consequences could be extremely high. So where does that leave us? After, and only after, a sustained period of significant pressure and deep coordination with our allies, we need to ready a diplomatic play. For diplomacy to succeed, however, its goal has to be achievable. So this won't be popular, but denuclearization is unlikely at this point, at least in the near term and at least under this regime. So we need to have some realism and develop some diplomatic creativity. We, in close coordination with our allies, should develop a diplomatic roadmap with outcomes short of denuclearization that would still effectively limit the threat in a meaningful and verifiable way. And then finally, we really need to turn up our defense game. We need to accelerate improvements in regional missile defense of our allies, as well as our homeland, so that we're better prepared in the event diplomacy fails, or even if it succeeds. This brings me to the second challenge, and this is the most consequential challenge, as others have discussed, China. To be clear, China's strategic intent is to chip away at decades of American security and economic primacy in Asia. And some are going to get squeamish over the idea of U.S.-China great power competition. But to ignore the fact that China is already in competition with us, would be tantamount to strategic malpractice. So I agree with Aaron on his comments earlier about the need for a big look at our China strategy. I do not mean to suggest that we should enter a new Cold War with China, nor can we cast aside areas of cooperation that benefit our interests. But we need to be clear-eyed about our long-term interest in preserving the American position, and that should be our North Star. To do so, the United States needs to invest in our comparative strengths and, by extension, our credibility. We need to get our own house in order to address this pure scale, as the chairman mentioned, of this challenge. Necessary budget investments, human capital investments, which is something that is not talked about enough, and overall strategy. And we need to move to the next phase of increasing U.S. presence, posture, and capabilities in the region. And that next phase is going to be a lot harder. In this regard, I'd like to thank you, Chairman McCain, for your idea and proposal on the Asia-Pacific Stability Initiative, which I hope the Trump administration will support. It will not only improve our ability to fight and win wars, it will improve our ability to keep the peace. This brings me to the third challenge, an enduring and persistent one, which is terrorism in the region. I think in the emergence of ISIL, the terrorist threat in South and Southeast Asia is evolving. And the bottom line here is we need to get ahead of it. And we have time to get ahead of it. So we need to take more preventive action on terrorism in South and Southeast Asia. So let me talk briefly about opportunities which tend to get lost in all of the noise. First, I'd say the biggest strategic opportunity is India. And here, the United States and India increasingly share a common strategic outlook on the Asia-Pacific, especially a mutual concern over Chinese military modernization and adventurism. But the question here is, can we reach a new level of cooperation to place limits on Chinese ambition? I believe it is possible, but only if the United States and India together persist in overcoming the suspicions of the past and build stronger habits of actual cooperation. And this is going to require the U.S. and Indian systems, which are not naturally compatible, to demonstrate mutual flexibility as well as ambition. The second opportunity, which is a near-term and high-reward opportunity, is Southeast Asia. As the chairman knows, the demand signal in Southeast Asia for U.S. defense engagement is on the rise, and we need to meet it. And while we can do more through defense engagement, we also need to do more on diplomatic, economic, commercial, private sector engagement in Southeast Asia. Whether it's in Vietnam or Burma or Sri Lanka, there are countless opportunities for the United States to build strategic depth in Southeast Asia. ASEAN also needs to be central to our strategy, and I would recommend Secretary Mattis continue efforts of his last two predecessors to host the ASEAN defense ministers in the United States at the earliest opportunity. Finally, this committee's leadership on Southeast Asia has been essential, whether it was by your engagement every year at the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is an important expression of American bipartisan commitment to the Asia-Pacific, or whether it was following through with action, as in the case of the Southeast Asia Maritime Security Initiative, a much-needed, timely inject of American effort to fill a critical capacity gap. Finally, the big one, the long-term strategy, the real opportunity for the United States. To retain our primacy, the United States needs to weave together its disparate security and economic efforts into a broader strategy. We need to fashion a networked security architecture with allies and partners to help all of us do more over greater distances with greater economy of effort, undergirded by a shared set of principles in support of a rules-based order. We need to present a vision for an equivalent economic architecture that promotes sustainable and inclusive economic growth and opportunity for all countries, including the United States. In the absence of meaningful American economic statecraft in the region, China is filling the void. And that has dangerous implications for our relationships, setting up false choices for our allies between their security and their prosperity. Besides these strategic implications, the lack of a serious U.S. economic initiative in Asia will leave average Americans at a long-term economic disadvantage. So in sum, the challenges and the opportunities for the United States are significant, but without urgent American leadership and the requisite whole-of-government investment, the United States will not be able to rise to them. And decades of relative peace and prosperity that American leadership has enabled are at risk. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Senator McCain. Good morning. Thank you, Ranking Member Reid and members of the committee, for inviting me to testify this morning on the challenges facing the United States in the Indo-Pacific. I have submitted a longer statement. I would be grateful if that is entered into the record. In my oral remarks this morning, I want to highlight 5 themes drawn from my written statement. First, the challenges posed by North Korea and China obviously remain the most dangerous problems facing the United States in the Indo-Pacific. The challenges emanating from North Korea are obviously real, dangerous, and in the near term. The challenges emanating from China are long-term, enduring, and aimed fundamentally at decoupling the United States from its Asian partners. In my remarks this morning, I want to focus primarily on China, and I want to thank my colleagues Victor Cha and Kelly Maximon for spending time on speaking about the issues relating to North Korea. The first point I want to make in this connection is that as we think about China as a strategic competitor, it is important not to think of China as merely a regional power.